Okay, thank you very much for joining us today at the Dearborn Public Library for a special time and well, for a special guest. All the way from London, England, we'll be joined by author Charlie English to talk about his new book, The CIA Book Club, A Secret Mission to Win the Cold War with Forbidden Literature. But first, a couple announcements. We've got some great events coming up. I'll be talking with. We've got programs coming up on John Williams, the closer between many of movie themes of late, and then we're talking with ESPN's senior writer Seth Wickersham about his new book about quarterbacks, and we'll be talking with Paul Myers about his new book about the late comedian John Candy. Those are all events coming up, and you just need to check our events website at dearbornlibrary.org. And then a couple of things about the format today. We'll be talking with Mr. English for about 45 minutes or so, and be glad to take some questions afterwards. Mr. English is a former journalist for The Guardian, where he's had several positions, including arts editor and head of international news. He's a fellow of the Royal Geographic Society and the author of 3 previous books, The Gallery of Miracles and Madness, The Storied City, and The Snow Tourist. As I said, he's coming out. We're glad to join him. We're glad he can join us from all the way from London, England. So please welcome Mr. Charlie English. Now, Charlie, you started off as a correspondent for The Guardian, and I believe I've heard in past interviews that you did, you kind of like working on books better. Is that the case?
Well, it wasn't always the case. I was a Guardian journalist for about 20 years, and edited most of that time rather than wrote. But towards the end, it was mainly news. And of course, the thing about newspapers is you've got to keep feeding this beast with stories, and it's a very short turnaround cycle. So you start again, you go home at night, late at night, and then you start again in the morning, and you do different things often the following day. So the thing about books I find more engaging, I suppose, is that you get to sink your teeth into a subject for quite a long time. I mean, in this case, it's taken about 5 years to produce this book, and that's fairly typical of me. So I'm quite slow. But yeah, I think there's something slightly more satisfying about being able to really get your head around a big subject like this.
Well, you mentioned the book that it's an oral history, and there are different formats to oral history. Like I've read books where, pardon me, that uh, they go by quotes, people's quotes, whether it's from diaries, whether it's from stories, and you take the tack of a narrative. Was that a choice?
Yeah, I mean, when I say oral history, I mean interview was a kind of very large part of my source material. It's not entirely oral history. There's also some documentation that was left by the head of the CIA book program, which when he died, which was found in a closet in his apartment in Manhattan. So I got hold of that quite early on. But the good thing about having that as a kind of basis was that I could then go to the names I found in that documentation and approach them and ask them about what they had done when they'd met this guy and so on. So it gave me a sort of concrete baseline, if you like, from which to then go and approach people. And of course, I could tell them, on March that whatever you met this guy, did you know he was working for the CIA and so on. So it gave us a kind of foundational document that we could build from. But then in terms of turning it into a narrative, yeah, I mean, that's very much what I always intended to do. My books are ways of bringing history to life, I like to think. I mean, I'm a journalist more than I am a historian, so the idea is to tell a story in as engaging a way as possible, and also to try and break new ground, so things that people don't know about or haven't come across before, which I hope I've done with this book.
Yeah, I was quite surprised to s- read the extent of the program. Uh, and it goes all the way back to 1951, where they sent where balloons were sent into Czechoslovakia.
That's right. I mean, it had its origins really in the end of the World War II. As you all know, the Americans were very worried about the threat of communism at the end of the war, and they started an organization called the Free Europe Committee, which was a sort of front organization of the CIA. And the Free Europe Committee, of course, created radio stations like Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, which were aimed at pushing the Western propaganda message, really, initially at least, into the Eastern Bloc, into the Communist Bloc. But they also wanted to broaden their offering. So they did these enormous balloon propaganda drops, which meant taking these trucks. They would leave the Radio Free Europe headquarters in Munich, drive out in a convoy of trucks with these gas balloons that they hadn't yet inflated, and then they'd find a kind of a spot just to the west of the Iron Curtain, make sure the weather was blowing in the right direction, of course, and then inflate these balloons and attach these big payloads of leaflets to them and launch them up into the sky. And the balloons were designed to reach a certain altitude and then pop, and then the leaflets would kind of rain down on the people below. But the trouble with this operation, which went on for about 5 years, was that there was no intrinsic value to the leaflets, and they had a message along the lines of, we're your friends, we haven't forgotten you, the free people of the West are still thinking about you, and so on. But there wasn't much else to it. There was no depth, there was no value in these things. And if you got caught with them, then the secret police on the other side of the Iron Curtain would be very cross with you. So what the CIA did over the years was realize that, as opposed to sending just propaganda leaflets, when they sent actual books, and I think the first book they sent by balloon was a copy of George Orwell's Animal Farm, which they sent in about 350,000 copies in the mid 50s in a special kind of lightweight aerial edition. And they launched this into the Eastern Bloc. Um, but and then they started experimenting with sending books through the post as well. And they realized that when they sent books as opposed to leaflets, people wanted to hold on to the books. And in fact, sometimes they would write back and say, can we have more books? And so there was an opportunity here, which the head of the program uh, saw clearly at that time, that literature was a more powerful vector, if you like, for freedom and free thinking than leaflets were.
Well, the way you described how the education, the Marxist education, was is like you almost had blinders on, and then to get a book, whether it's 1984, Gulag Archipelago, I was like, mind blowing.
Yeah, I mean, in these countries, there was a draconian system of censorship, which was based on the model that had been developed in Moscow soon after the Russian Revolution. And so what this meant was that a central bureaucratic apparatus that was working for the party would go through everything that was published in that country, every play that was performed, everything that was put on the radio. Even if you wanted to print a kind of business card or a wedding invitation, you needed permission from the censor's office in a country like Poland. So this was designed to stop certain ideas that didn't fit with Marxism, Leninism from coming into the country. So, there was a kind of intellectual desert, if you like, in the Eastern Bloc. The head of the program called it a Stalinist straitjacket. And so the idea of pushing this literature into the bloc was to try and free people from this and to give them the options and the fruits of kind of intellectual free thinking that were available in the West at that time. So the operation moved from being sort of fairly crude propaganda, if you like, to being a much more sophisticated literary offering, which was very much taken up in the Eastern Bloc. People were very keen on it. A lot of people, these books had tremendous value when they got there. And yeah, you're right. I mean, in the 50s, particularly, you would go to school and there would be a portrait of Stalin probably on the wall. You would have to speak in a certain way in public, and which was different from how you could speak at home. So these very Orwellian concepts existed of kind of double think and newspeak and so on. So when people got a chance to step out of that and read this material, even though it was illegal, then they often chose to do so.
Like the ways that the books were smuggled in was rather incredible. I mean, as I saw an article about from John Simpson, the BBC World Affairs director, where he talked about, oh, he just put a friend said, oh, why don't you bring a Gulagak fellow next time you go in Russia? And like, oh, okay. And he put a old dust jacket over it, and he was able to get it through. And he stopped and he goes to Gorky Park, and it's like goes to the shady guy and is like, "Here's a book," and they're like, "Okay, bye." And just the ways that they were smuggled in, like a diaper or just and false cases and shoe boxes and shoe cases. There was quite an operation.
Yeah, I mean they sort of developed it as time went by. So they moved in the late 50s. They began a what they call person-to-person distribution system. So this meant that, I mean, it began in London. Actually, in West London, there's a suburban street where this Polish guy who used to work for the Free Europe Committee lived. And if you were a Polish traveller from the Eastern Bloc and you came to his house and knocked on the door and announced yourself as being from the Eastern Bloc, then he would give you 3 or 4 volumes of CIA bought books, kind of on the understanding that you would take them back to your home country and share them around when you got there. And this was tremendously successful. Soon word got about in Poland that this guy was giving away free books, which of course had a value, a kind of financial value in the Eastern Bloc too. So more and more people would show up at his door, and he started expanding this operation. So there were particular distribution points in London here, for instance. There were, I think, at least 5 or 6 bookshops, libraries, you name it, just places where East European visitors could come and announce themselves, and they'd be given these free books on the basis that they would go back to Eastern Europe with them. So then they moved to like fishing ports where Polish trawlers would show up, or when touring mountaineering clubs would come to Western Europe, or orchestras, or groups of visiting priests. They would all be approached by people who were working with this program, and often end up taking back in their luggage vast quantities of illicit literature. And then by the 1980s, you had they had in Poland particularly, they had a sail training school that was allowed to sail yachts along the Polish coast in the Baltic Sea. And sometimes these yachts would pop over to Sweden, which is not really all that far away, and they would offload Polish vodka and take on board illicit literature and carry that back to Poland with them. And they even had kind of special smuggling trucks that were built that had secret compartments in that would carry books through the Iron Curtain under the guise of humanitarian aid. So yeah, as time went on, this got more and more sophisticated. And I think, I mean, the head of the operation claimed that in the 35 years or so the program ran, that something like 10 million titles were carried through the Iron Curtain. So it was really a phenomenally large amount of material by the end.
Well, it wasn't always, the program wasn't always supported by CIA, but as you described, CIA was mostly like uh, paramilitary, I guess, or work with guns as opposed to books, especially during the 80s with Bill Casey as head of the CIA.
Yeah, I mean, I think as one sort of former officer told me, the agency tended to split into the paramilitary types who'd come from the armed forces, and they liked to, they saw themselves as kind of running dirty wars in Latin American countries, or trying to depose left-leaning regimes. And then there was the more kind of intellectual wing, which was the political psychological staff. Often these people had come from Ivy League colleges, universities. They were very well educated, often spoke the languages of the countries that they specialized in. So there was a kind of natural tension, if you like, between the intellectuals and the more paramilitary types. But the trouble for the book program was that the people who got the top jobs tended to be the paramilitaries. So they didn't really see the point in sending literature into the Eastern Bloc. And in fact, this guy told me that he would go to his boss and say, can I have $100,000 for works from the Silver Age of Russian literature? And the boss would look at him and go, are you a moron? This is a complete waste of our money. So there were various moments where the program was under threat. In fact, there's a documented period during the Carter administration when it seems that the funding is going to be cut by the controller of budgets. But luckily at that time, there was a very powerful national security advisor called Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a Polish American himself and knew very well how powerful these programs were in the Eastern Bloc. And in fact, his own books were being distributed by the program, so there was a small conflict of interest there. But Brzezinski was a great fan of the program and persuaded Carter to, I think, not only continue the program, but also increase its budget to an extent. So yeah, it was constantly kind of under threat, if you like, but managed to continue for this great long time of almost 4 decades through the Cold War.
Now, uh, before martial law, uh, there was a lot of underground printing, and it was just so. I remember myself having the old carbon copies, having to do that. I imagine, I mean, it was hard enough to do one page, mind you, many, 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 many pages, and it was quite an operation in itself.
Yeah, I mean, so what happened in the late 70s and into the 80s in Poland in particular, and I talk about Poland a lot because Poland is where, of course, the Cold War ended. It was the first communist regime to collapse. And Poland also took to these books more enthusiastically than I think any other country in the Eastern Bloc. But in Poland, in the late 70s, they started the opposition began a system of underground printing. And you're right, it began with, a few people with typewriters, and they would copy, 6 or 7 newsletters at a time. I mean, so we're living in Poland where there's a communist regime. Everything is censored. The opposition realize that they've got to get their message out somehow, and they can't do it through any kind of formal channel. So what they do is they type out these newsletters to explain what their activities are and so on. And from the carbon paper system and typewriters, they moved quite quickly to more sophisticated ways of copying. I mean, I think they used these things called mimeographs, which I
Yeah.
used to have at school, which were kind of, they produced these strangely often in purple lesson notes, but you cranked through the machine, and it was a kind of spirit chemical system. So they worked out they could do many more copies with that, and then as time went on, they would end up using offset presses, which are really quite sophisticated bits of printing kit, and you can run out about 10,000 copies of a newsletter a day with that kind of technology. So this was a big underground movement in Poland from the late 70s right through to 1989, and it was supported quite strongly by the CIA, which really built on book program contacts. So the literature program that had begun with sending leaflets and then was sending books, um, towards the end of the period was also supporting sending inks and printing presses and all that kind of printing materials that you needed to duplicate the material in situ, because of course it was easier to reprint in Poland than to smuggle published copies in. But also it meant that people could produce their own underground newspapers in Poland and their own publications, so they didn't have to go through the West always to get things that bypass the censor.
The solidarity trade movement played a great role. I was surprised to read that it played a great role in this. With example like the Gdansk Agreement, where it supported, it said, "Hey, we need to support this literature," and then tune people supported the trade union with, like you said, their private private publications.
Yeah, I mean, solidarity was you began in the shipyard strikes of August 1980 in Gdansk, and quickly became the main opposition movement in Poland. So in those strikes, they won all sorts of freedoms for Polish people that no one else in the Eastern Bloc had, including the right to have an independent trade union, which was Solidarity itself. Um, but the Soviets couldn't bear the idea of this kind of rolling back of their communist system. And so in December 1981, a Polish general called Jaruzelski, who I'm sure many people will remember, um, basically launched a coup and declared martial law in Poland, and then arrested something like 10,000 people who were involved with Solidarity and put them in internment camps. So this had the effect of driving this opposition movement underground. And really the only sign that Solidarity was still alive at the end of December 81 and into the following years was the underground publishing movement. So quite soon after the declaration of martial law, which involved, by the way, smashing up print shops all over the country and confiscating printing equipment and illegal literature, so quite soon after that, people were again, they would go back to the carbon paper and the typewriters, um, and then gradually build their capacity with help from American intelligence and others, build their capacity back so that, for instance, in February of 1982, there was a very influential underground newspaper called Mazovia Weekly that was launched in Warsaw, which was supported by the CIA. Um, and that was a very influential underground publication that carried on throughout the period until the start, I think, of 1989. So, Solidarity veterans will tell you that the only sign that Solidarity was still alive in those early years after martial law was the output of their underground printing presses, which were distributed quite widely, so the population knew when they looked at one of these things that there were people who were organized enough and intelligent enough to be able to do this, despite the fact that they were living in a state of war, effectively.
Uh, then perhaps we should mention about the immigrant community in Paris, which had a uh, it's kind of like their lifeline. When you mentioned Maslovia Weekly, that they would put what used to be classified ads in the paper saying, or in code saying that they would get shipments or get money or get what they need for their work.
Yeah, so I mean the system of supporting this paper was that there was a very famous Polish literary figure who was based in Western Paris. His name was Jerzy Giedroyc, and he, he'd fought in the kind of Polish Free Army in the war, and ended up after the war in Paris, and created a publication called Kultura, which means culture, which was a very influential political literary title. And he always managed to get this into Poland somehow, by hook or by crook. And quite early on in his career in Paris, he went to America and did a deal with the CIA where they would pay him a certain amount of money. And so Giedroyc was a CIA asset based in Western Paris, very influential on Polish politics throughout the diaspora, but also in Poland itself. And he knew channels and routes by which he could get money into Poland, often, with couriers whose identities are kind of secret even to this day. Um, but he would get money. I think he paid $1,000 a month to Mazovia Weekly, which, in those days was an enormous amount of money. I mean, you could hire people for a year, several people for a year on that kind of money. So this meant that the publication had a continuous source of funds. And as you rightly say, in each edition, they would put in very small um, type at the bottom of the last page, a sort of thank you. There was a little thank you bar, and it would say something like, thank you, J, for one, which meant thank you, Jerzy, for $1,000. And this was the system by which Giedroyc knew that his money had got through, because the publication would come out of Poland, and then he would go through it in his office in Western Paris and just check that actually what he'd sent had arrived at the right destination and wasn't being kind of embezzled by somebody en route. So yeah, that was generally the system that the underground signaled to the people who were helping them in the West, of whom there were many, not just Giedroyc, that their money was actually being used for the purpose it was designed for.
Well, speaking of Matsovia Weekly, I thought it was kind of nice when I saw that they had a prisoner of the month entry. But uh, they went through quite an ordeal to keep that going. There was what they would call a lot of health and safety rules because they wanted to keep the solidarity leaders that were out of jail stay out of jail, and just to simply print it. And they were mostly women. Now, please. I apologize for my pronunciation. Helena Lu, uh,
Łuciwo.
yeah, uh, yeah, they kept it going despite great odds.
Yeah, I mean, Helen is a very formidable person, and found, I mean, in fact, the night that Jaruzelski declared martial law and troops were on the streets, and they went round to her apartment to try and arrest her, but um, she was out with her husband. They'd gone to the cinema that night and were sort of wandering the streets for much of the night, and managed to evade the militia and the police. So she found herself at large, as other women were, because the authorities were essentially fairly sexist and basically thought that only men were people of interest in this story, and so they rounded up lots of men, but um, left a lot of women at liberty. So within days of this happening, Helena got together some of her friends. She was a journalist before martial law, working for the Solidarity Press. She had other friends, other women friends who were also working in aspects of the Solidarity Press. And I think within 2 days they were meeting in a secret location in Warsaw, making a plan as to how to respond. And they came up with various priorities. They needed to secure the remnants of Solidarity, whoever was still at large. They had to kind of get them to safe places, and they had to start rebutting and putting out information about what was actually going on in the country. And this developed over the months until the launch of Mazovia Weekly, with into a kind of system. I mean, they call it health and safety in Poland, which is a euphemism for, I suppose you would call it, spy tradecraft or
Yeah.
underground tradecraft. And what it meant was building a system of drop boxes and special apartments, and places where you could print and do the various processes that were involved in producing a newspaper. So quite early on, they needed to put together a whole kind of roster um, of people's apartments, so that which they moved incidentally every month or so. They would rotate all these apartments around, so they needed a great long list of places, and this was partly for them to live in. It was partly for them to hold their editorial meetings. But then all the processes I described, like typesetting and printing and so on, were all done in separate places. So the idea was that there were cells of people, so nobody knew how the whole system worked. Um, and when you did your job, so supposing you were charged with typesetting, um, someone would bring the typesetting machine to the typesetting apartment, which you were given the address of, but you wouldn't know where the machine had come from. You would do your job and then put the product of that in another place, and then a courier would come and pick that up and take it on to the next line in the next process in the production line, if you like. So there were these kind of they called it a kind of canal lock system. The idea that was that if the security authorities arrested someone and interrogated them, they would know about one little aspect of the operation, but wouldn't be able to roll the whole thing up. But yeah, these health and safety laws got very elaborate, and there were methods of losing a police tail. But there were certain bridges in Warsaw where you could race there in your taxi, dive out of the taxi, run down some steps, and get into another taxi on the road below, thereby shaking off the secret police car that was probably tailing your taxi. They had, whole handbooks of this stuff, and ways of kind of foiling the state, if you like.
You focused on several people during the talk, probably most prominently Miroslav Trojecki.
Hoyetsky,
Trojecki.
Miroslav Hoyetsky, yeah.
Yeah, he played quite a role. I mean, you described his prison, how he's taken to prison, and then how he was part of the immigrant community, and he was Minister of Smuggling.
Yeah, he was formerly the Solidarity's minister for smuggling. Yeah, in the Solidarity martial law period. I mean, he's an amazing character. Unfortunately, he died yesterday morning, which is a great sadness to me
Oh,
and
I'm sorry to
many
hear that.
others who were in, who worked with him. But he was a tremendously brave, extraordinary, remarkable man. He in the late 70s, when he was politicized, really, he was a kind of founder member of the underground publishing system, he used to be arrested because the secret police knew this, but they could never sort of catch him in the act, as it were. So they would arrest him all the time. I mean, I think he was arrested something like 44, 45 times. He served quite a lot of time in jail. The police would harass him, his family, his friends, try to turn them into agents to inform on him, threaten his children, and so on. Um, but in 1981, he left Poland briefly to come and negotiate with Americans, partly about how to get more funding for his operations, and was caught outside the country when martial law was declared. And he realized very quickly that if he went back to Poland, then he would just be thrown in jail. And he'd been in jail quite recently, and he just thought there was absolutely no point in going to sit and rot in a Warsaw jail. So he became a one of these dissident figures in the West who's, he devoted his life in those years to helping his friends who were still in Poland by supplying them with as much support, logistics support, publications, printing presses, and so on as he possibly could. And in fact, a few days after martial law was declared, he was in Washington. He was staying with a friend of his called Jan Nowak, who was a big Polish figure in Washington at that time. And Nowak introduced him to Casey, who was the head of the CIA. And quite soon after that, Mirek Chojecki moved to Paris to work with Giedroyc, and was working with the CIA for the next 8 years, right through till 1989, supplying material to the Eastern Bloc through these kind of covert channels, and running the smuggling operation that supported Solidarity.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that he passed. I guess for uh, the how you uh, wrote about him is was very appealing. It's like you felt like you knew him. So, just a couple more questions. The I found it was kind of I mean, they cover that the effort for a cover when the International Literacy Center and how each person had their own area of the department, uh, how they were they were responsible for distribution of books for this area. This person did this area. This person did this area. It was quite an effort, quite a cover.
Yeah, I mean, it was this office in Park Avenue South in Manhattan. It was on the 14th floor of this rather undistinguished looking office building. And the name on the door was International Literary Center, which was a sort of I mean, the CIA, I think, called them brass plate. It was the sort of the cover name of the CIA book program. And then you went in the office, and I think it was arranged a bit like a newspaper. I mean, I obviously have that background, but there were various desks that were devoted to different areas. So you went right around the corner, and there was the Soviet section, which was quite a large section because that was obviously the main enemy. But you turned left from the door, and then you went into the East European section, and then there were desks for each individual East European country. Poland, being the largest East European country, was the one that got the most resources, if you like. And there was a desk editor for each country section. And the man who led the Polish one was called Adam Rudzki, and he was a great sort of veteran of the program, had been working for the FEC since the 1950s. And so the books would come in, people would pitch them books, and they would arrive at the desk, and then the editors would go through them and decide which ones were going to suit their purposes best, and then decide on the name of the list of targets, where they were trying to get the books out to. I mean, some of this was through the mailing program, so they had names and addresses that they were specifically targeting, but then others would go through the distribution, person-to-person distribution, and they would go to bookstores in London or Paris or Vienna or Rome or wherever it was. And so, yeah, there was a very great sort of I think quite tightly controlled system. The head of the program, George Minden, was actually, he was a stickler for budgets and was quite careful about where he spent his money. Um, but their tentacles, I mean, someone described it as this great international network, which had tentacles all around the world. In North Pakistan, for instance, there would be people, representatives, trying to slip books to Soviet soldiers who were in Afghanistan at that time. Zimbabwe, the Canary Islands. I mean, it really was a global operation. And the further you were from the center of it, the harder it was to work out exactly who was in control of the whole thing.
Okay, final question. And this is very general, but what is your opinion? Did the books win the Cold War?
Well, I wouldn't ever say that they won the Cold War. I think, you have to look at multiple reasons for the ending of the Cold War. Um, Obviously, I think the main one is the failing economies of the Eastern Bloc, and the fact that the system just didn't really work as well as the system that was operating in the West. There are other causes like the war in Afghanistan. The CIA at a certain point were funding the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to the tune of something like $700 million a year. So this was where 80% of the overseas spend was going. But I think the books program, by contrast, cost a few million, maybe sort of $5 million a year or something like that. But I think it definitely had an outsized effect for that budget. And I have spoken to a lot of people in Poland about what impact they thought it had. And there's a very famous dissident called Adam Michnik, who spent a lot of that time in jail. Um, and he said to me, we should build a monument to books because it was books that were victorious in the war. And, you know, for a dissident like Michnik, who's also a literary figure himself, there's no question that the drip effect of of literature over the years kept the kind of idea of freedom alive in Poland, and the underground printing operation in particular had an enormous impact and actually ended up toppling communism in Poland, which of course is where it all began. It was kind of the first domino to fall. So I wouldn't claim it was the only thing that won the Cold War, but I think it had a very significant and really unheralded effect on the situation.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, we'll move on to the Q&A part. Those online, you can submit a question through with the Q&A button at the bottom. I see one already. Then I got several questions here in person, sir.
Yes. Can you explain why Boris Yeltsin was making some strides toward democracy, and then this throwback Vladimir Putin shows up? What was responsible for his emergence?
Would
Um, I I think I heard that. I can't.
responsibility for Putin's
Yeah, I'm not by no means a specialist on Soviet and Russian affairs. I mean, the uh, the situation in Moscow really was in the 80s was Gorbachev was the person who was kind of trying to liberalize things. He recognized, I think, that he needed to open up, Russian and Soviet society, and particularly the economy. So he launched Glasnost and Perestroika in an attempt to do that. But it's, when you've spent 60 years trying to root capitalism out of your system, to kind of gradually reintroduce it is extremely difficult, as he found out. So post him, there were a series of power struggles in Moscow, of whom Yeltsin was the kind of initial beneficiary, and then Putin latterly, and things, of course, have gone in a very different and difficult direction since. But I'm not an expert on Putin's rise to power. I can't really go into more detail on that.
Ma'am?
I'm wondering, given the current political and cultural climate in the United States, that is kind of anti-intellectual, I think I'm wondering how we could whet the appetite of those who have that anti-intellectual attitude, and possibly help introduce challenges to critical thinking in the way that it sounds like it was done in the CIA book club program. Does that make sense?
How
could we share in our country with people who are resistant to the idea of critical thinking, intellectualism, challenging authority, etc. How can we kind of entice people to think for themselves, to to read Animal Farm, and be, how can we get, yeah.
Yeah, I can have it. Well, I'll have a go. I can talk to some of that. I've done talks in Polish organizations over here in Europe, and the question I'm usually asked is, how can we send 1984 to the US?
Yes.
And there's a sort of great irony here,
Yes.
in that certain, as I'm sure you know, certain bits of the US, and I don't think it's the whole country, but particularly Iowa, I think is bad for it. It started sort of banning certain titles. And in fact, I found that some of the same titles and authors that the CIA was sending into the Eastern Bloc have been banned, or are in the process of being banned, in schools in Iowa, including 1984, An Animal Farm, and works by, I think, Aldous Huxley as well. So yeah, it's a very I'm not there, but from here it looks like a very worrying moment, and a sort of anti-intellectual moment that comes out of extreme partisanship, I think, and a sort of desire to punish the sort of cultural left. And yeah, I don't know what can be done about it, except, these are all political decisions, of course. They're done in the name of free speech, which is another huge irony. But we have to kind of defend the people's right to read what they want, and I think that mostly, as I see it, these bans are being done through pressure groups working at a kind of state level, getting state level legislation passed. So I think it's really quite a small number of people in each state who's involved in this, although it's obviously coordinated. And I think it has to be resisted at every turn.
May I just add one follow-up on that?
Okay, one quick follow-up.
Person to person, how can we maybe nurture that person to person action here or activism, maybe use that or here to create change.
Do you have
Well, it's
any
yeah. I
thoughts?
mean, I think it's about you know, the strength of the CIA program was this kind of network idea,
Okay.
and I think, you know, the book banners are sort of networked, and I think the anti-book banners should probably be networked too. So
Oh, yeah.
start a network.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
First of all, I just wanted to tell you that it's a fascinating book. I'm from Poland, grew up during these times that you wrote about, as a naive person who was not interested in politics. But but your book is so fascinating, and especially the CIA part. I'm on page 50 maybe, so I haven't read the whole thing.
It gets better.
Oh, well, it is good already, but I was very much aware of the help, of this monetary help by labor unions in the US, which was very considerable, and I knew about it. However, CIA, it's completely different story to me. It's actually an eye-opener. I even taught Polish culture at university, so I was always interested. I'm not a historian. So I don't know, is your book, is my understanding correct, that your book is like very first, a comprehensive book on that topic? Because this CIA involvement was sort of, people felt very ambivalent about it, and you write about it. You write, I don't remember at the very beginning of the book, how the solidarity people, how they felt about it, right? Because that was official propaganda, which was saying, oh, CIA is doing it. It's not the solidarity movement. It's not grassroots Polish movement. It's foreign imperialism, right? Just doing stuff. So it is still even, so it is a little bit ambivalent, not little bit, huge, I would think, ambivalency about accepting this money from source, which is a dirty source, right? Dirty wars, like you said, right? But anyway, so I'm sorry because it's a little bit too longer than I thought, but so is it, so it's like two questions out of it. One question is your book, and sorry that I don't know. The first
Is it what, sorry?
Is your book the first one, such a comprehensive book on the topic of CIA involvement? First one. So my second question is, what did these people, how do they feel, the solidarity people in Poland, about, some of them probably didn't know, or did they know? That's one. And I have actually the third question, which is, you said that most of these documents are still classified. When are they going to be declassified? And okay, thank you. But it's fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. Let me try and get quickly through those. Yeah, it's not that it's the first book I think that tells the story of the book program in Poland in a kind of narrative detail. There's a book by a guy called Seth Jones, who's a sort of think tanker in Washington, who talked about a very specific CIA program that started in '83, which, so there's a bit of overlap with some of my material, but I think I would say mine is the first kind of full narrative account. How is it received in Poland? Yeah, I mean, I talked about this idea that it's a kind of taboo subject in Poland, because I think people who are veterans of the opposition don't want to have their revolution stolen by the Americans with all their money. You know, there's that kind of idea, and I think I have a lot of sympathy with that, and so I've tried to I think accurately portray it as a sort of partnership between people who were going to do this thing already. A lot of emigre publishers were already trying to smuggle literature into Poland, and the support of the CIA, which came in with, you know, an enormous amount of money in their terms, and supported a whole ecosystem So I think with one without the other would not really have been able to exist, or certainly not in the way that it does, or it did at that time. In terms of how people actually decided to work or not with the CIA, there was a lot of I mean, it's a kind of don't ask, don't tell situation. You know, I think people suspected where the money was coming from. Minden, who was the head of the book program, would go around telling people he was a sort of millionaire philanthropist who had a lot of money to give away and was really interested in Eastern Europe. And I think with a kind of nudge and wink, people thought, well, you know, I'm not going to go too far into that. I'm not going to ask too many questions because I know, well, I might get to an answer that I don't want to hear. And this was very much, you know, if you're Polish, you will know that the way Poles worked in that time was in a sort of conspiracy where people didn't ask too many questions. If you were asking questions, then there was probably a chance that you were involved with the secret police in some way. You might be an informant. So I think this kind of fitted their modus operandi anyway. So yeah, I think that's what I would say about those things.
And my third question was about it's classified information.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
So yeah, the vast majority of the documents relating to this program are still classified. There's no indication that the government is going to release them at any time soon. I spoke with a former chief historian at the CIA who is the only person to have written a book based on the classified documents, but unfortunately his book is still classified, so no one's been able to read it apart from people who are in the CIA. And he actually made a film of it, but that's also classified. So hopefully one day all this stuff will be released and then we will get the full story, but there must be a mountain of material there somewhere. I mean, I suspect they're not releasing it because people are still alive who were involved in this story, and they might think it's compromising in some way.
Was a very short one, but what they kind of, how was it done? So CIA actually, so somebody operative of CIA would go to a bookstore and purchase books, which were later on arranged to be sent somewhere. How was it done? I didn't understand that part.
Okay, so let's take the Librairie Polonaise in Paris, the Polish bookstore in Paris. If you're a Polish person, you can go to the bookstore and you say, I'm from Poland and I would like some books. And then the person who runs the Polish bookstore says, okay, well, I can offer you these titles, or you can choose these titles. You get 3 or 4 books. You take them back to Poland in your luggage. Hopefully you don't get stopped. Some people might, but it's a small offense if you've only got books for personal use. The bookstore then bills the International Literary Center in New York on a kind of weekly, I think, basis. So they tell them how many titles they've gone and so on. And then the money flows back from the ILC in New York to the Polish bookstore. And at one point in about 1982, half of the business that was going through the Polish bookstore in Paris was CIA money. So, you know, that's the scale of the thing that of how it's operating.
Oh, all right. Well, thank you very much, Charlie. It's been
Pleasure.
great talking with you. It's very enlightening. Quite a book. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.